How's that? Better? So I'm trying to keep my nerd stuff to a minimum. But as I was going through this section today, there's a little bit of the nerd that's going to come through today. Just a little bit. Mark in his gospel this entire time, chapters 1 through 10, has been constantly time and time and time and time and time again putting Jesus on display so that we can understand who he is and what he came to do. And as I was thinking through all of this stuff, there's this one scene that came to mind. If any of you have ever watched The Hobbit, it's not in the books if you're curious, but it is in the movie. There's this section where this dwarf is talking to Bilbo about their king. This dwarf's called Balin, and he's talking about Thorin Oakenshield, if you really want to know all the nerdy details. But there's a section, and he's describing everything that his king did, and all of the ways that got them to there, and how this king was so great, and how he led his people well, and all the things that he did. And the statement came out like this. He was talking to the Hobbit, and he said this. After watching him, he said, "There's one who I could follow. There is one I could call king." And that's his reaction after observing and seeing and watching this other dwarf guy. His response was, I could follow him. And I think that's what Mark is trying to do with us as we watch and understand and see Jesus, is to elicit the exact same response. As a matter of fact, I was asking my wife yesterday, and I was thinking through this myself, and I'd be curious for you guys to answer too. If I were to ask everybody in this room, is there somebody in your life who you have interacted with where you would say, that person, I respect and revere and honor that person so much that I would be comfortable and confident, and actually it would be a joy to me to say, I will follow you. And I would be honored to call you my king. Do you know anybody like that? Besides Jesus, which is the cheater answer, not that one. But we have presidents and we've seen kings all around the world. I know for myself, I'm not sure that there's anybody that I could say, I would put my life in your hands, I would put my trust in your hands, and I would be delighted to bend my knee to you and call you king. And that would actually be a joyful thing to me. I don't know that I've ever met anybody quite like that. And you're all some fine folks, don't get me wrong. But to put that kind of faith and trust in someone, I'm not sure. Well, in today's text, in chapter 10, verses 46 through 52, we come apart. We see this story that in many ways is sort of a culmination of much of everything that's happened so far in the book of Mark. As Mark has been putting Jesus on display, who he is and what he came to do. Right? Because we remember, one of our verses is that the time is fulfilled, right? The kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel. Jesus came to proclaim himself king of the kingdom, and the kingdom is now here, and he is its king. This is good news. Because unlike all the other people you think of that you wouldn't bend a knee to, this is a king that we can. And he's worthy of it. And he came to announce this. And then he displayed it over and over and over again to everybody that he interacts with. And we get to this section again in Mark chapter 10, verses 46 through 52. And I'd like to read this section and then pray. And it says this. And they came to Jericho, because he was on his way to Jerusalem. And as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting there by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and said, Call him. And they called the blind man, saying to him, Take heart, get up. He's calling you. And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "Rabbi, let me recover my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Go your way. Your faith has made you well." And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. Would you pray with me this morning? Father, I thank you this morning for sending one to us who is worthy of all glory and honor and praise, and one we can call King. We thank you for your Son who's given us hope, salvation, understanding, and sight. And I ask this morning that through your Spirit and for your glory and for the blessing and encouragement and the conviction and the joy of your people, that you would allow me to the greatest degree possible in a fallen man to display your glory and the glory of your Son Jesus through the words that you shared with us through your servant Mark in this gospel. Please help us through your word to see and to know your Son, to rejoice and to delight in all he has accomplished, to trust and to obey him, and to live in the joy of his accomplished work for your glory and our future hope. Help me to do that well for your people and your kingdom. Amen. This story, I know off the bat, it might seem like just kind of a simple story. There have been many like it, and you can find similar ones, many like them, in the other Gospels. There's a blind man by the side of the road, and Jesus makes him see. It can come across as just another one of those things, but as we go through and we understand everything that has been building up to this thing, to this particular story, and where it lies in the book of Mark, and what Mark is doing with this story, I think this story has much more significance than just simply another healing story. Now, that in itself, we shouldn't take for granted. If we had somebody who could do those kinds of things, that would be mind-blowing in and of itself. But on top of that, it carries even more significance in this Gospel of Mark. This is actually the last story of a healing recorded in the book of Mark. This is the last one. After this, he's going to be moving on to Jerusalem, and the rest of the chapter is about 3/5, or 3/8, I'm sorry, something like that. A little more than less than 3/4 of the book is going to take place in the last week. Sorry, that's too many numbers, right? The whole rest of the book is going to take place covering just 1 week of Jesus' life, right? We've had this whole thing so far in the last 10 chapters. We've covered probably almost 3 years of ministry, and then the last 4 or 5 chapters is just all going to be about 1 week in the life of Jesus. And he's going to Jerusalem. They call that the Passion Week. He's about to walk into Jerusalem. And this is the last story before he enters Jerusalem. And he enters in, as Pastor Mike will be preaching next week, he enters in as the king. That's how they welcome him into Jerusalem, is as a king. And this story is the last healing that's a culmination of many of the other healings and an example of much of the teaching of what Jesus has said. And it all happens right before he walks into Jerusalem, being heralded as king. It's a significant place in the story. And they came to Jericho. And as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. Now, just a little bit of context here, a little bit of history and information. For many of you, maybe you remember Jericho is the place where Joshua came and they blew some horns and all the walls fell down. This isn't that. Jericho, this is actually about a mile south of that. There weren't very many people at this time who lived in Jericho where the walls fell. They sort of rebuilt the city, maybe about 100 years before this. They kind of rebuilt the city about a mile south, and they called that Jericho too. That's where he's walking through, is a place just outside of Jericho that we're normally used to in the Old Testament. And also, for some context, this road, maybe some of you remember a parable that Jesus gave. It happens in Luke 10, parable about the Good Samaritan who was sitting on the side of the road all beat up. this is the road that Jesus was describing. It's the same road between Jerusalem and the city of Jericho. It is the same road where he tells the parable about this Good Samaritan. That's where Jesus is at, walking from Jericho to Jerusalem. And as he leaves this rebuilt city of Jericho and is heading to Jerusalem, there's a man by the side of the road. And he's with a great crowd at this time. And there's a great crowd there for a reason. Again, it's Passover. People from all over Israel are traveling to Jerusalem for Passover. And many of them are crowded around Jesus specifically because he's very, very well known at this point. And sitting on the side of the road is a man named Bartimaeus. Now, his name, and this is just an interesting little point here, Bar means son of. Timaeus means Timaeus. It has its own definition, but it's interesting that the way that Mark introduces him, because he calls him Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, which Bartimaeus literally means son of Timaeus. So sort of a double thing there. He says, this is the son of Timaeus. By the way, his name is the son of Timaeus. And it's this funny thing that happens there, and I think there's a bit of a reason for this. But that's what that means. Bartimaeus literally means the son of Timaeus. And this man, he's literally blind. But as we go through this story, we're going to see that he's actually, in some ways, an illustration of somebody who, though he's literally blind, he actually kind of understands and sees better than almost anybody else that we've seen up until this point in the book of Mark. He understands and is used by John Mark, the author, as an illustration of so much of what he's been talking about to this point. At this point, everybody has heard of Jesus, but through the Gospel of Mark, there's been this recurring theme that I'm hoping through this time that you've picked up on, that even though Jesus is sitting there and he's talking and he's preaching and he's explaining and he's displaying and he's doing miracle after miracle, he's raised people from the dead, he's cast out unclean spirits, he's talked in parables and in literal terms about the kingdom of God, and he's told them who he is, all of these things. And yet over and over and over and over, nobody gets it. Nobody understands. Kind of like Bartimaeus, there's this sense that everybody is still blind. They don't understand what Jesus is talking about. Even in the last couple of sections, which we'll talk about again, right? The disciples are asking them for things, and this rich young ruler is asking for things, and none of them, you can tell by the questions that they're asking, they don't understand what Jesus is here to do. They don't understand the hope that he's bringing, and they don't understand what kind of king he's going to be. They don't get it. Everybody has hard hearts. And we see this happening in a variety of different ways. Everybody's blind. Some of them are blind and in absolute opposition to Jesus. Right? They're pushing back hard like the scribes and the Pharisees who, on every occasion, they try to do mental battle with Jesus, trying to point out why he's failed or wrong or not enough or all of these things, and every time he comes out on top. But they're in absolute opposition to Jesus, and they're blind. They don't understand who he is. There's some people who are blind, and they're interested in Jesus, but it's a very superficial interest. It's surface interest. And oftentimes these are described in the book of Mark as the crowds, right? We even see a crowd gathering around him here. They're all of these people, and they gather to Jesus because, well, he's interesting, he's unique, he's the newest thing on TikTok, he's whatever, right? He's intriguing. People are getting healed around him, he's making food out of thin air, he's doing all of these things. Why wouldn't you be curious and want to go see what's going on with this guy? But they're not, they're interested, they're not opposed to him, they think that's pretty cool. But they're not really looking to follow him. They're not really interested in bending the knee to him and calling him their king. They're just intrigued by him as an event in culture. These are often defined as the crowds in the book of Mark. And then there are some who are blind but are earnestly searching and trying to understand. But they are still blind. like the disciples, right? There's kind of two different groups. Oftentimes when we go through and we see the movies and we do all the things, we think that the only people who were following Jesus were just these 12 apostles. But the reality is there's actually a giant group of people who were constantly following Jesus. There was many more than just the 12. And there was a large group of people who had followed Jesus around from place to place, and they were very interested. It wasn't superficial. They believed that there was something special about him. They believed and perhaps even understood to some degree that he's going to be significant, and they wanted to learn. And you would often see through many of the stories gathered up to here that Jesus, after he taught, he would take this group aside, sometimes the 12, sometimes more of the disciples, and he would give them sort of a bigger understanding of the things that he was just teaching about. They were the ones who didn't just go home at the end of the day. They stuck around and they said, I want more. I don't just want the food and then to go home, and I don't just want to get healed and then see you later. I want to follow you. But even the disciples are described through the book of Mark as still having hard hearts. Not as an insult because they're jerks, but because they still don't see it. They still don't understand. Not yet. And this blind Bartimaeus, in many ways, is a stand-in. It's an illustration of everybody else who, to this point, they still can't quite see who Jesus is and what he's doing. They don't understand and recognize his nature. They don't understand his kingdom. They don't understand his purpose. And they don't know what it means for him to be the Messiah, the Christ, the once and future King. They don't see what he's about to do. They don't grasp it. And this blind Bartimaeus is sitting there, and as we go through this story, picture him as sort of an example of so many others and of what Jesus is about to do. And when he had heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he, this Bartimaeus, began to cry out and to say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And then he rebuked him, telling him to be silent, be quiet. And he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped. And he said, call him. And they called the blind man, saying to him, take heart, get up. He's calling you. This man recognizes Jesus. It would seem from the text that, of course, as he's walking through, so many people know who he is, that he's heard from the crowd, because everybody's talking about it. Everybody's saying, he's coming, he's coming, he's coming. And he's most likely heard from this crowd that Jesus is passing through. And he's blind, so he doesn't know exactly where he's at. So what option do you have? If you want to get the attention, you don't know where to run, you don't know what to do. So what does he do? He does the one thing he can do, and he yells. He yells out. And Mark records here a remarkable thing. This blind man, Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, he cries out, and the name that he gives him is the first time that this is ever used in the Gospel of Mark, and is massively significant. It is hugely meaningful. Now for us, we see all these different lifts of the name of Jesus, and we don't necessarily delineate them or think about them a lot or register them. But for those who are reading in the original context, for a Jewish man to hear the title, Jesus, Son of David, that would have been like lighting up the sky with insinuation of who the person of Jesus is. That title is massive. It's gigantic. It carries a tremendous amount of weight. And this Bartimaeus, this random, poor, blind, helpless man by the side of the road, this is how he addresses Jesus. Jesus, and he yells it. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Mark records this term here specifically to make a point. What is he about to do? He's about to walk into Jerusalem as the king. That's what he's about to do. And the term Son of David has everything to do with Jesus being the king. And not just any king. Not just a king. The king. 2 Samuel 7 through 11 describes this. Miss Melissa read this for us earlier at the beginning of the service. And here's a little bit of context because that passage is so important to this, and I'm going to give just a little bit of background on it. See, King David, who is sort of the pinnacle of kings for Israel. If you were to go back, we do this in America, who's the greatest president? Some people might say Abraham Lincoln or George Washington or what have you. If you were to go in Israel and say, who's the greatest king? Who's the one that exemplified kingship in Israel? It would have been David. David was the man. David was the display of what kingship ought to be. Despite his failures, despite his failings, still, he was a man after God's own heart. He was the King Arthur of Israel, if you will. The idyllic symbol of how it should be. He was God's anointed. He was the king that Yahweh used to bring security and stability and unity to Israel. He was a man after God's own heart. And at this time, see, David was looking to build a temple. This was many, many, many years before Jesus. And David was looking to build a temple, which in itself is significant because the temple, which it used to be in sort of a tent where the tabernacle was, the place where man met with God. It was in a temporary shelter for many years. And David, who's now sort of sitting on the throne, and Israel is united and secure and powerful and all of these things, and David sits back and he says, I want to build God a real house. Not just this temporary piece of cloth, but a real house where we can go, because that's where you met with God, was in the temple. And David wants to build God a real temple. One where men can go there and it will be glorious and beautiful and it will be a display of the glory of God. It will reflect His power and His glory and His goodness through architecture, through all of these things. That's what David wanted to do. He wanted to honor his God through a glorious temple where people would meet with Him. That's what he wants. And God tells him no. He tells him, you won't make me a temple. Through the prophet Nathan, he sends the prophet Nathan to him and he says, no, you aren't going to make me a temple. You're a king who shed much blood. There is peace, but it's come through war. But he makes him a promise. He makes him a promise about that temple. And this promise carries this really fascinating thing that happens oftentimes in the Old Testament. It has this double meaning. And you see two things happening at one time. There's this sense in which some of the things happening here are going to be fulfilled through his son, King Solomon, who does build a physical temple, and he does do some of these things, but he doesn't fulfill everything talked about in this text. There's another side of this that has a very eternal aspect to it. So Solomon seems in some ways, there's this double intention of this prophecy that Nathan is about to give him. One of them fulfilled now, and one of them ultimately fulfilled later. And you see both of them overlapped on the same prophecy. I'm going to read it again. Again, Nathan comes to Samuel in verse 11 through 16, and he says this, from the time that I appointed judges over my people in Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares that the Lord will make you a house. And when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. And when he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, and with the stripes of the Son of Men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. There's some senses where Solomon fulfills this. But there's many ways that Solomon cannot fulfill this. Solomon did not last forever. There's a future king. And this was understood. This isn't just us picking this idea out and reading something into it. This was clearly understood in the Old Testament, that this idea of a son of David, an offspring of David, one who would come from the line of David, would have an eternal throne. And we see this not just here, but constantly, many other places. Psalms 89:3. I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to David, my servant. I will establish your offspring forever and build your throne for all generations. Later on, much later on, Jeremiah 23:5. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, long after Solomon. And he shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. It cannot be Solomon. That's the ultimate point of this. These are written after Solomon. Again in Ezekiel 34:23-24. And I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David shall be prince among them. I am the Lord. I have spoken. This term, Son of David, it invokes the idea of the Messiah, which is filled out in many other prophecies through the Old Testament, talking about a future king who would come, whose throne would be eternal, whose rule would be righteous. In him there would be perfection. In him the blind would see, and all of these amazing and incredible things that would happen in this king. Justice would be executed, and he would serve God's people for all generations. Through the first 10 chapters, we see exactly this happening over and 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 over again. Just the beginning of it. But we begin to see it. Right? We see unclean spirits recognizing Jesus as this Son of David King. On multiple occasions, they call him Son of God, they call him Son of Man, they call him all of these things. But that's just the unclean spirits. They recognize him. Peter recognized him. Jesus had asked him at one point, who do people say that I am? And they give a couple of different items, and then Jesus asked them, who do you think that I am? And Jesus answers them, and he says, you are the Christ, the Messiah, the promised King, the Son of David. And Jesus tells him that he's right. But the only one to this point to have recognized and confessed that Jesus is the Messiah is just Peter. Despite all of the things that Jesus has done, Peter's the only one who's made some kind of statement that alludes to Jesus being the Christ until Bartimaeus. A random, blind, poor, impoverished, blind guy on the side of the road. He, of all people, you would think that it should have been clear to everybody else, and then maybe Mark would have recorded it from the other disciples and from the people who were seeing these amazing things and all this stuff, but he doesn't. It's just Peter and then a random blind guy on the side of the road named Bartimaeus. And all of a sudden here Bartimaeus, right before he's about to enter Jerusalem, cries out and says, Jesus. And he defines who he is, Son of David, and all of the messianic, kingly identity that comes with it. This is a profound statement. He is acknowledging that Jesus is the rightful king to the whole shebang. And he sees it, even though he's blind. And he plays with this idea, Mark in this gospel plays with this idea that it's ironic that there's a man who's physically blind, but he's sort of spiritually aware in a way that nobody else has been. And he declares Jesus as the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of David. And it's interesting that the people rebuke him, right? So he's crying out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And the people, the crowd who are gathered around, they see him, and he's a blind beggar. He's out there just trying to get money. And so they tell him, knock it off, be quiet. Jesus is doing important things. He doesn't have time for you. Very similarly, they did this before with the children. Just a couple verses back. And they told all the kids, and they rebuked the kids, hey, Jesus is too important for you. Don't bother him. Don't bother Jesus. But this king is not like the other kings. This king and his economy and the way that his economy works is very different than Herod's or Caesar's or Pilate's. See, this king cares about the people who are on the side of the road. And this king, just a little while ago, and actually Mr. Tim just quoted this verse to me just a couple of minutes ago. See, this king came to be served. I'm sorry, I just said it exactly wrong. 100% backwards. This king came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. We read this just a few minutes ago. This king came to die on a cross, not to be glorified in this world. This king came to love and to give of himself. But people don't understand that. And so they're trying to get Bartimaeus out of the way because they're still working on an earthly kingdom level. Important men don't spend time with unimportant men, which is exactly the opposite of everything that Jesus has been saying. You want to be great in God's kingdom? Here's what you do. You serve. You want to be great in God's kingdom? Here's what it looks like. You act as a slave to those around you because it's about them and not about you. And that's exactly what Jesus does. That's exactly what Jesus did. And that's exactly what Jesus continues to do. So much so that about a week from this time period, he's going to be on a cross, dying for everybody. He came to serve in a way greater than any of us ever could. And he exemplifies this again. The crowd is pushing Bartimaeus away. And Jesus is saying, no. Go get him. Call him. He's important to me. I want to serve him too. I want to help him too. Exactly the opposite. They still don't see. How many times has Jesus made this clear, calling the children to himself, serving those people in 100 different ways, and they still don't get it from him. They're still blind. But Bartimaeus understood who he was, and he calls out. And then he does this interesting thing that I think is really ironic. Jesus doesn't go over to Bartimaeus. He actually kind of gives them their one-uppings, and he says, no, you got it wrong. I want you to go bring him back to me. Go call him. All you people who've been trying to shut him down, here's what I want you to do. You go get him and bring him back. Go call him for me. I want him here. So the same crowd who was just setting Bartimaeus aside and telling him to be quiet and rebuking him are the same people who he's just telling them to go get him, to call him. So they kind of have to eat a little bit of crow there, which I think is kind of humorous. But they called the blind man, and all of a sudden there's this big switch of attitude. Right before they were rebuking him, and now they call the blind man, saying to him, take heart, be encouraged. Get up, he's calling you, the King of all the universe, the Son of David, the Anointed One, the Promised One, the Messiah, the Christ. He's calling you. Come. He wants to talk to you. Even you, the blind beggar on the side of the road. And Bartimaeus' response, pretty reasonable. And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, what do you want me to do for you? And the blind man said to him, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. And Jesus said to him, go your way, your faith has made you well. And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. So his immediate response is this. He tosses everything aside and he runs to Jesus. He has hope of sight. The son of David, the king of Israel, the prophesied one that they've been waiting for thousands of years, is here, and he wants to talk to a blind man on the side of the road. What would you do? I would run too. I would like to think I would run. Especially if I knew that he was going to fix me and all of these things. I would get there as quick as I could too. I don't know exactly. If he ran, he moved quickly. He was still blind. I don't know how he did it. But he got there. And this is in such contrast, right? Everything that he's crying out. And again, and I want to put pressure on this illustration. This is so different. Mark is doing this so intentionally, and he's laying this story out. This is so different than the last few stories that we've read in the book of Mark and the people who are coming to Jesus. It's so different. This man is light years opposite of them. For example, the disciples, if you remember just one story back, Jesus was proclaiming that he was about to go to the cross, and he was about to die, and he was about to be beat. And the immediate response for the disciples as he's going into his kingdom is, can I be vice president and can I be secretary of state, please? That's how they respond to Jesus. They kind of have this idea that maybe he was about to be king, and their request was, I would like a place of honor in your kingdom, if you please. They expected that they deserved that spot. They expected, because they were good friends, and there's a reason maybe why they might think that, right? They were his buddies, and they were commissioned in many different ways, but they go in asking for glory. They go in expecting to have a high place. And it's in a huge contrast with the rich young ruler, who was very similar. If you remember, this was a couple of sermons back now, just a little bit ago, where this rich young ruler comes in and he has everything. And he comes to Jesus and he says, man, I've got all of the commandments nailed and I've got all of this. I've done everything right. What do I need to do to get into your kingdom of heaven? I'm pretty sure I've done everything right. Right? He certainly wasn't, just like the disciples, we're not going to Jesus and saying, you're my king. Whatever you want, I will do. You just tell me where to go and you tell me what to do. You're in charge and I'll follow you. That's not what they were saying. They were all expecting in some sense that they had control over things. And they came in arrogance and in pride to Jesus. And both times, Jesus says, in the case of the disciples, it's not mine to give you. And you're asking for the wrong kind of greatness. And for the rich young ruler, he says this, great. He doesn't even argue. Of course, this young man did not follow all the law perfectly, and it's impossible. Nobody can. But even without arguing that point, Jesus says, all right, my arrogant young friend who has accomplished all things and is glorious beyond all imagination and rich and wealthy and all these things, here's all you need to do. Just sell everything you have and follow me. No big deal. And you can't do it. Because here's the deal. At the end of the day, he was more interested in stuff than Jesus. This blind man is the opposite of all of these things. He is empty, he is poor, he is needy, he is humble, and he requests in absolute humility. He demands nothing, but pleads and begs. Unlike the others who feel like they can demand or in a place of deserving, this man comes to him in a place that he recognizes he's owed nothing and he has nothing to give in return. He simply comes to Jesus as a needy, humble man. He asks for mercy. And unlike the father, some chapters back, there was a dad whose son had been plagued by an unclean spirit. And the dad came to Jesus and he requested another way too. He says, if you can, Jesus, if you're able to, if you're capable of such a thing, can you heal my son? And Jesus corrects that dad quickly, but that's also not how Bartimaeus comes to Jesus. He doesn't ask, well, they say that you can do this, but I'm not sure. He comes humbly, and he comes with the assurance that Jesus can do what he asks. He believes in him. He trusts him. And he asks him, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. And Jesus said to him, "Go your way, your faith has made you well." And immediately he recovers his sight, and he follows him along the way. In this phrase, there's another word. There's two more that I'm going to look at very briefly that have kind of double meanings. First, he gives Jesus another honorific. He calls him Rabbi. In the original term, it's actually Rabboni, which is the difference between sort of like a teacher and the teacher. This term that he uses when he calls him Rabbi is not simply saying, "Hey, teacher guy." It's saying, "You are the teacher of teachers." It's an honorific. It's a very respectful way to talk to Jesus. So he doesn't just say, "Well, hey, you're the pastor of this place," right? And you can make that comparison, right? I'm a pastor, but then there's the true pastor, Jesus himself, the true shepherd. Right? I could say I'm sort of a shepherd of a flock here at RHC, and you guys are all very nice, and you don't throw tomatoes very often or rotten vegetables, but I'm not the shepherd. I'm a shepherd, but I'm not the shepherd. And that's the difference between Rabbi and Rabboni. There's Rabbi, and then there's Rabboni. There's teacher, and then there's the teacher. And that's how this man talks to Jesus. Rabboni, the teacher, the shepherd. Let me recover my sight. Jesus says, "Go your way, your faith has made you well." And this reflects very similarly to Mark 5:34. If you guys remember this story about a woman who is bleeding and she comes to Jesus and something very similar happens, and Jesus responds to her too, and he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Jesus' response to her and to him are very similar. And here's this interesting section why I point this out. The term "made you well," right? There's a specific term. It's in the Greek word. It's sozo, which can mean either saved or restored, and it's this double meaning: made well or saved. And so there's sort of this parallel insinuation in this chapter, right? This man, walk with me through this for a second. This man is blind, and he goes to Jesus in faith and in humility, requesting to be healed, and Jesus saves him. Does that sound like anything to you? I hope you're hearing the parallel here, right? On the physical realm, you could say this man was blind, and he gave to Jesus, and Jesus physically made him well because of his faith. But in the spiritual parallel, this man is blind, and he goes to Jesus, and Jesus says, "Your faith has saved you." All through the work of Jesus. This is an intentional parallel by Mark. We're supposed to read both of these things into this going on. This man is both a display of physical and spiritual healing all at the same time. That word is a double word that's intended to be read both ways. He was rescued from his disease. He was rescued from corruption in his heart. He was saved from blindness into a new kingdom. And his response is simply this. Like the demoniac, and this is one of my favorite stories, like the demoniac who had an whole legion of demons in him, and he was living in the tombs in a very unclean place. He was an unclean man. And Jesus came, and Jesus rescues him too from these demons. And this man's response was simply this to Jesus: "Please, I want to follow you." After he was saved and redeemed, his response was that he wanted to be with Jesus. "I just want to be with you. I'll go where you go." Now, in that case, Jesus said, "I've got a different task for you to do. Follow me, but in a different way." And this blind man does something very similar. Right? Jesus' response to him is, "Go your way. Your faith has made you well." And of course, this is Jesus, and so it took effect, and immediately the man recovered his sight. And this man's response was simply this: he followed him on the way. Now, Mark doesn't make it clear, right? Do we know whether he followed Jesus all the days of his life? I don't know. It doesn't tell us. Does it mean that he became his disciple? I don't know. It doesn't tell us. But inside of the illustration that Mark is using, Jesus heals him, saves him, makes him see instead of being blind, and the response is this: he follows Jesus. That's the way it's supposed to work. That's how it's supposed to be. When the humble, poor in spirit, blind, and needy come to Jesus, recognizing that he is the true King, God grants them grace, salvation, and all that we need. Jesus is the true King. He came from heaven. Before him was glory beyond anything that we could imagine. And he set every bit of it aside to walk on a dusty road between Jerusalem and Jericho to talk to a poor man who had nothing to do with nothing. And he spent time with this young man, this old man we don't even know. But the King of all heaven and earth was even concerned with a random blind guy on the side of the road. That's our King. That's one who we could follow. That's one who we can call King. He set all of his majesty aside, not seeking his praise here, all of these things, to save us, the broken, the lame, the hard-hearted. In his ministry here, Jesus, as we culminate all of these things, everything that he's done in these first 10 chapters, right before he's about to go to Jerusalem, he's shown himself to be the powerful, awesome, authoritative Messiah and Christ and Son of David and Son of God and Son of Man. This is the King who walked out on the waters and calmed the storms of chaos in the sea, commands the wind and the rivers. This is the King who, though he could command the very powers of nature itself, told the disciples, no, let the little children come to me. Don't stop them. I care about them too. And that same one is the same one who could go into demonic places in the middle of the worst, scariest middle of the night, in the middle of the tombs with a demoniac who was able to break his chains. And by the simple power of authority told him, stop it. And the unclean spirits fled before him. And this same one is the same one who could go to a man who's leprous and not allowed back in the city, and he made him clean, not just restoring his health, but restoring his ability to be part of the community again. This is the same one who was able to commission 12 men and share his own authority and power and tell them also to go out and to cast out unclean spirits. This is the man who could talk with the greatest minds, the religious leaders of the time, the scribes and the Pharisees who spent their whole time educating themselves in the law, and Jesus would decimate them intellectually over and over and over again. He did all of this with truth and with love and with compassion and with patience and with perfect obedience to the Father in heaven. This is your King. This is my God. This is one we can follow. There are times I also happen to like war movies and things like that. And you see there's one show called The Band of Brothers, and there are these men, and it takes place during World War II. And you can almost get a taste of this, just a small taste of this. When they have good commanders, and you can tell if you've ever watched the miniseries, there are some commanders who everybody wanted to get away from. They knew to follow him was to go to your death. He was going to get you killed because he was an idiot, or he was uncareful, or he didn't care. He was going to get you killed. But then there were some leaders where the men would follow them into the worst nightmare of battle because they trusted their leader, whomever it may be. And you see some of those pop up every now and again. You could maybe say that David was something like that. You watch David, the king who was set on the pedestal as the greatest of kings of Israel, and you could see that to some degree. And his men would follow him anywhere, and they did. And they died for him. And a good leader can actually tell one of his people, for the sake of our group, for the sake of, I'm asking, please go sacrifice yourself for the sake of what we need to accomplish. And sometimes you'll find men who can lead that way. But even those men are broken. And even those men are imperfect. And even those men make mistakes. And even those men are failures. None of them are like our king. Not this king. This king is the King of Kings. This king didn't come to lord it over us, but came to serve. Not because we shouldn't be lorded over by him. He has every right to lord everything over everyone. But he doesn't seek that. He earns it from the love and the hearts of his people. And he displayed that because he came to first love us. And it's only after he displays that he has first loved us that we can even understand and begin to see the glory of his kingdom and the glory of his leadership. There aren't a lot of men in this world who like thorn, oak, and shield, that many of us would stand beside and watch and say, there's one who I follow. There's one I'd call king. A mark in this story as sort of an illustration of everything else that Jesus has been doing in the book of Mark so far. His whole point is to lay this out in front of you and to lay it out in front of me as he's about to go into Jerusalem and announce his king. The question is this: have you seen enough to make a decision? Is he good enough for you to follow? Does he have your heart? And when he talks about following, see, this isn't like, okay, you've got my vote as president for like maybe 4 years. You're kind of like, I'm not wholly convinced, but you're better than anything else. So we're going to do that for now. Not that. This king doesn't just ask for your temporary vote. This king is the king of the universe who asks for everything. And here's the kicker with this one. He's actually worthy of everything. And then on top of that, this king, when you give him everything, which is actually virtually nothing, what he does is he turns around and he says, welcome in my kingdom, because actually I'm giving you everything. You come to me with nothing to offer, but in return he offers you a kingdom, and he offers you eternal life, and he offers you hope, and he offers you love, and he displays before us a kingdom that we can't even fathom, and he is the kind of leader who we know would lay everything down. And how do we know that? Because he did. He did. He went to a cross, and he didn't just die a temporary death. He actually took on our very sin. No commander in all of military history has ever been able to accomplish such a thing. This king, this man, this God, hung on a cross in the greatest display of leadership and glory and power and honor and sovereignty and love and generosity and beauty and holiness and righteousness and justice. None other has done anything like this. He gave us everything. Through his death, through his life, through his resurrection, this king has given us life and hope. So here's the question. And I'm going to cut it off now. I'm done. How much will we follow this king? Really? This isn't a presidential election. This isn't a HOA vote for whoever might be the best HOA leader for a little while. This king is asking for our everything. And he's promising us far more than we could ever give. So, will we, like the disciples, will we respond not just in some superficial way, like, yes, I'll come to church on Sunday mornings because I love you so much. That's not what he's asking. He's asking, will you be his forever, all the time, 24 hours a day? He's saying if you give as he gives, he will give you more than you could ever imagine. Will you follow? Do you trust him enough to put your family and your finances and your children and your parents and your brothers and your sisters and your community and your country? To put all of those things at the feet of this king, and then be able to walk away and say, and you know what? It's better at your feet than in my hands. Because I trust you, my king, more than I even trust myself. Do you find your security in bending the knee to Christ? Because it is more secure than to try and keep our fists wrapped around our stuff and our time and our things. That's the kind of kingship that he asks for. It's everything. And he's worthy of it. And he's proved it over and over and over again. So here's the question. Not just theoretically, not just as a concept, not just as like, oh, that's a nice church thing, but earnestly every day you wake up. Do you look at Jesus after everything his mark is laid out, and you say, there is one I will follow. There is one who can be my king. Will you bend your knee to him? Will you follow him? I'll tell you this. Our only hope is in him. The realistic result is this. We can reject him and we can say, I want to keep everything to myself, but I promise you that down that road there is only death. You cannot do it. I cannot do it. We cannot do it apart from our King. But if we set it all at his feet, and we call him our King, and we put our security and our hope and our family and our finances and our time and our future at his feet, and even so much to the degree that if our commander says, I'm going to go ask you to lay down your life for the sake of this kingdom, we would say, I trust you. I'll go. Because I believe in your kingdom. And I trust you as my king. That's the king that Bartimaeus describes when he calls him the Son of David. He's the Messiah, the Christ. And even as he's going to walk into Jerusalem next week in this story, they'll get a glimpse and they'll get a picture, but they still don't understand. But Mark wants us to understand. Is Jesus your Son of David? Is he my king? Is he your king? Will you truly follow him? Would you pray with me? Father, the reality is we are a mixed bag. We constantly battle sin. We can't do this apart from your help, your spirit, and we'll talk about that as we go forward. Father, I pray that you would enable us and equip us, that it's so hard for us to relinquish control and to trust you. But Father, I pray that you would help us to be like Bartimaeus, that we would throw off our cloak, that we would set everything aside, and that we would run to you and recognize, Father, that we are empty and we are humble and we are needy and we have nothing. We desperately need you. We desperately need your Son. Father, help our hearts to pursue your Son as our King, as our Savior, as the lover of our soul, as the bridegroom. All of the ways that we talk about this, the head of the body. Father, help us to constantly follow your Son and to see him as one worthy of us laying everything down before. Help us to do that with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And may you be glorified, Father, and help us to long and take joy in the hope that the King is bringing a kingdom, and that a kingdom will be beautiful and eternal. And in it will be justice and mercy, and there will be no more blindness. And in the kingdom, Lord, there will be no more sickness, no more strife, no more anger, no more war, no more hardship, no more hunger. There will be only glory and joy in the kingdom of your Son. Father, help us to long for your Son and for the kingdom that you prepared. Amen.
Amen. You stand and please.